Welcome, initiates. Today's Akashic word is inkling. But not just the inkling that might be a notion that comes to you, but the inklings. Of course, most people do know who that constitutes, and that would be J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, Oxford professors who got together as with their other friends, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, and A.C. Harwood, from the time they were students, and they would discuss their works, what they're writing, their poetry, and basically inspire each other. Now, one would ask normally, why in the world is he talking about the inklings as if it has something to do with the Akashic or truth or initiation? Well, that is going to be what today's talk is about, because the article that goes along with this is called The Inklings and Anthroposophy. And I always like to get straight to the meat of the matter and come back to it again with elaboration. But these two people, A.C. Harwood and Owen Barfield, were anthroposophists. They were the major anthroposophists in England at the time, along with another man named Dunlap. But literally, A.C. Harwood is the first, and for 27 years, the most noted Waldorf teacher in England. And so he picked up the work of Rudolf Steiner in Waldorf education, and he ran what is now called the Michael Hall School. But he also, for 27 years, helped Dunlap and others run the Anthroposophic Society in England. And so you cannot get a more dyed-in-the-wool anthroposophist than A.C. Harwood. And A.C. Harwood and Owen Barfield were dear, dear, dear friends of C.S. Lewis. Matter of fact, they took all their vacations together. And in those days, vacations were you'd take literally a long period of time and you'd walk across a whole section of England, staying at inns each night. And that's what they would do. And that's where the idea, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien did this also, Charles Williams also, but not as much. But those three, Harwood, Barfield, and Lewis, literally did this all the time. Matter of fact, Lewis loved Harwood and Barfield so much that he was the godfather of one of each of their children. He dedicated numerous works, C.S. Lewis dedicated numerous works to these children. And as a matter of fact, in the Chronicles of Narnia, he dedicates it to these, and he gives a funny description of what are literally anthroposophists who wear natural clothing and keep the windows open and eat only healthy food and blah, 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 blah. So he is kind of making fun of them. Because what people don't understand, and it is in writing, C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield, for their entire life, had what was called the Great War. Now, the Great War was a battle between the two of them, with C.S. Lewis being an atheist and Barfield being totally Christian because he was an anthroposophist, a philosopher. He was a Waldorf teacher along with A.C. Harwood for quite some time at the beginning of that Waldorf school. But then he had to go back into being a barrister and helping his family. And so A.C. Harwood and Owen Barfield did not come to a lot of the later meetings of the Inklings. But as all the Inklings called him, Owen Barfield was called the first and last Inkling, because he was there from the beginning when it was even a poetry reading group that had a different name, and then it morphed into this group. And basically, this group was there to inspire each other. And so my contention is very simple. Recently, I read a few books, but one of them in particular had a great title from an anthroposophist, and it basically said that the Inklings and the cosmic Christ were connected. Great title, great idea, but the author didn't really quite follow through. And one can follow through, because what I'm going to tell you today is very simple and clear. Anthroposophy, filtered into the works of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, his Silmarillion, is all about anthroposophy and the previous times that Rudolf Steiner talks about on Atlantis, and Lemuria, Hyperborea, and Polaria, these ancient ages. And literally, or J.R.R. Tolkien in a book called, this one here, called The Lost Road, describes these ages, and he describes them from his understanding that he got from Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy through Barfield and Harwood. That's a clear, simple fact because he literally says so. As a matter of fact, this book right here, it's called The Lost Road and Other Writings. It's an incomplete story. But what it is one of the most complete time-sweeping pictures of what Tolkien thought he was doing in trying to find out the true history of the English people. And that's what he wanted to write on. Matter of fact, he was an expert in Anglo-Saxon history, and he insinuates in something he wrote, which is called the Notion Club Papers, which you can only find, again, as an incomplete work, as an unfinished work, Sauron Defeated. You can find something that stands out strangely like a sore thumb. It's called the Notion Club Papers, 1945. And what it is a description of the Notion Club, the Inklings, Notion, Inkling, and they take up a challenge, which is at the beginning of this, but then Tolkien writes a story. The Notion Club Papers are all about these people in this club trying to figure out how to time travel. And what does Tolkien come to? He comes to the issue that he believes, as Owen Barfield put in his philosophical works, An Ancestral Voice and others, that there is an ancestral voice. And Tolkien was trying to tune into that ancestral voice and go back in history to reconstruct how it is that the English people came to be. Now, that's a great mystery, and we have done intelligence reports on it and all kinds of articles on it. It is truly about a being called Scythianus. Scythianus left Atlantis, went all the way to the east, and came all the way back, and it mixed up everything. And so they can't to this day figure out where the Celts came from. Who are they? What was their origin? Where does the Mabinogian stories of the Irish fairy tales and so on and so forth come from that are somewhat of a mysterious cloud hanging over the history of Britain, of Anglo-Saxon England? And he believed that he had insight into that. And he says in this description, The Lost Road, very, very clearly, that the people in Middle Earth, the higher developed people, came from a land called Numenor. And he says right in here, and he says in other documents, which I put in the article which accompanies this, that Numenor is Atlantis. Clear as a bell. Then he goes on to describe that if you leave Atlantis, if you leave Numenor, that it sunk. And the people who were more developed moved in their ships to Valinor. And so the high kings and the elves and the old elves and the immortal elves all left and went to Valinor. And then they moved from there to what's called Tol-Erisa, or the Blessed Isle. And from the Blessed Isle, if you were fortunate enough to ever go to the Blessed Isle, you could see out in the distance the beginnings of the rest of the Blessed Isles, which is the eternal land. And that's the Lost Road. There's no road that will take you there. In the story of Lord of the Rings, at the end, the people who held the ring and been ring bearers, they got on a ship and they went to the western lands. Anything moving towards the west is a reference to this ancient past that Tolkien was trying to capture. So in his story, The Notion Club Papers, he has two people kind of freak out, and they think that they all of a sudden are channeling something from their ancient incarnation on Numenor, on Atlantis. And they literally have names and they have roles, and he describes them. And he also makes associations with somebody being reincarnated from the time of Alfred the Great, an Anglo-Saxon person who was writing down the history, a chronicler. So Tolkien is basically saying, and I believe that the two people he was talking about was himself and A.C. Harwood, or Owen Barfield, more than likely Owen Barfield, and that the two of them were pivoting off of each other, and they kept traveling to the west, going to the west of England, then to Ireland, and then to the west of Ireland, and then longingly looking to the west because he knew that his history was there. This is time travel. Now, why is that important? This whole talk is going to be about what is called the Inkling Challenge, which was the challenge to create stories that could realistically take you through time, through space, time, and even dimensions or consciousness. And so there was a challenge that was given to them at a certain point, which I'll describe in a minute. But Tolkien wrote this story. It was unfinished. He never put a date on it. No one knows the real date. And I'm suggesting that it's very early on, exactly like The Lost Road. Those were pieces, those were fragments written about a history that literally goes back to what Rudolf Steiner calls ancient Atlantis, ancient Lemuria, ancient Hyperborea, and ancient Polaria. And if you look at the description Steiner gives about those things and the description Tolkien gives about those lands, they're very similar. Now, Tolkien didn't quite get to the point that he could write fantasy where there was, for himself, I guess, a believable space travel or interpenetrating dimensions. So he stuck pretty much with history. Why? Because he spoke 13 languages. He was a linguist. He was an Anglo-Saxon expert. He knew history backwards and forwards, but he could see through the history as if he had eyes that were there at that time. And that was his time travel. That was the way that he time traveled. And that's how he put it in this story. And then throughout Lord of the Rings, many people will say that this challenge that was created by the book that they all read early on, called The Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay, a book that C.S. Lewis said was intolerable and irresistible. And it is. It is the most difficult book I have ever read, and I've read it now numerous times. And every time I read it, I realize how very, very, very difficult it is. Not only because of the content, but also the way that he writes. He's not that great of a writer, as Colin Wilson will tell you, who has written books about David Lindsay. But what I believe happened was one day after this book was printed in 1920, one of the Inklings got a hold of it. And I would think it had to happen then because this book did not sell. Matter of fact, it turned into remainders very, very quickly. So where would they have gotten exposure to it except when it was first released? And that was in 1920. So sometime in the early 20s, I believe, one of the Inklings brought the book, and we hear them speak of the challenge. And we hear them speak, and in the article I quote them, the Inklings talking about David Lindsay and the effect that the book had upon them. But the effect that is universal, which I call the Inkling Challenge, was that they read it and said, this is very disturbing. Strangely enough, when I found this book, I gave it to all of my friends, especially the ones who were in our little club called the Monastic Club, which is really the same thing. And what I said, read this, and please get back with me because it's disturbed me tremendously. I believe it's a philosophical work, but it also gets into religion and psychology on a level that I've never seen anything do ever. And so far, only a few people have ever gotten back to me on it. But the Inklings did. The Inklings read this book, they talked about it in their group, and they created a challenge. And the challenge was the Inkling Challenge to create believable time-space travel. Now, what is believable? Believable to them, they very clearly describe, because some C.S. Lewis even wrote about the nature of science fiction, and so did Charles Williams and others of the Inklings. And by the way, there were many other Inklings. Roger Lancelot, what's his name? Roger Lancelot Green was a student of C.S. Lewis. He was a member. There were many other members. Tolkien's own brother-in-law was in it. Tolkien's own son was in it. Many people were involved in this, but this is the core group. So what was it? They wanted consciousness, not mechanical devices. So all of a sudden, when you read David Lindsay, he gives you challenges in the first part that are so difficult. He's in a seance, and some being comes from another planet and appears, and another being comes in and kills him. And you're like, this is the strangest opening to any story I've ever read. I'm very disturbed. It's so disturbing. And then the guy who kills the being from another planet who came to visit as a manifestation, a physical, psychic manifestation during a seance, invites them, tells them they have to go to the planet Arcturus. So they go to this tower, later, and they go up the tower. The more they go up the tower, the more time and space telescopes, until they go up to the top, and then they get in this device and they shoot off to Arcturus. Because Arcturus, the star, is a twin star, and the planet Arcturus is around the twin star. And the starlight comes to the Earth, and then it goes back. And if you can capture it before it goes back, that's the propulsion system that David Lindsay uses to drive this 40-foot-long crystal spaceship to Arcturus, simply basically sailing on a stream of light returning to Arcturus. Very strange. And the whole thing is strange. And then when you get there, then it becomes hyper strange. It becomes literally psychedelic, hyper strange. Organs develop out of what we would call the third eye. An arm grows out of the heart that can feel more than anything that's ever been felt before. Everything speaks to you. There's different colors. There's different. It is a completely different landscape. And in this landscape, the character meets all these people and goes through the most earth-shattering, life-shattering questioning of what could be philosophical points of view, and some people believe, but certainly sociological, psychological points of view that are different than the main character, and he changes throughout the whole thing. And in the end, you can't really tell what has happened, but you can tell that you changed. And I believe that's what the Inklings were after. They wanted to have space travel, time travel, and consciousness through dimensions or whatever else the consciousness can manifest. They wanted to understand mechanisms that were believable. Well, Tolkien never got into the space travel. He never got into the dimensions. He got into time. C.S. Lewis, he wrote the space trilogy. Holy moly. He went wild with space travel. He did some of the most radical science fiction space travel that I think is still available. He basically goes to Mars and goes through the war in heaven. He goes to Venus and goes through the Garden of Eden. And so he's working on this, what he called the Great War, this struggle with being an atheist and wanting to be a Christian, but not believing all the Christian religions. But he ended up believing the Christianity that Rudolf Steiner promulgates, the same that Harwood and Barfield promulgated. So C.S. Lewis, we can say that time travel was the intent of Tolkien, and in these two books we see him take up the Inkling challenge and try to do time travel that is believable, which he basically says, it was indicating, comes right out of the human being remembering previous incarnations, as well as being able to go and look at the Akashic records. Because really that's what Tolkien is doing. He's going back, he believed, and looking at reality, not fiction. And so when he was writing these things, he's very convincing. I think I say something in the story about, or in the article about, with a sentence he can create an environment, in a paragraph he can create a world. He has the most amazing ability to take you through your senses into a direct experience that is believable. But why? Why is it believable? My belief is because it's backed up by spirituality, anthroposophy. It's backed up by spiritual science. They are realities that he's describing. And therefore, he was the master of time travel in that he tells us the time before, when there were different types of human beings, men he calls them, when there were elves, when there were hobgoblins, when there were orcs, when there were hobbits, when there were wizards, and there was the Elendel, there were the elves. Some of the elves are eternal, some of them are the men from Numenor. He describes all of these mystical, magical things that connect you to a long developed ancient past that is far beyond prehistory. And he believed it. And the reason it's believable is because Tolkien is not just in the imaginal realm, the realm of images, which we've talked about so many times before as the first stage of initiation. He went into what they call high fantasy. In other words, a fantasy that is so developed that it's believable as if it's almost real, that it exists somewhere. And that was his absolute beauty of what he was doing. And by the way, of course, his books for a long time were the some of the best-selling books in the world, and translated into more languages, and on more curriculums for children than probably any other work. And then you have this term, crypto-fiction, that was developed by H.G. Wells. All of these Inkling authors were profoundly influenced by H.G. Wells. You know so because they take some of their devices, literary and mechanical devices, to do the type of science fiction that H.G. Wells came up with, and he called it crypto-fiction. In other words, science fiction. So what he's trying to indicate here is that it's actually real. The crypto part is the hidden part, the occult part, the esoteric part. And so let's remember, H.G. Wells invented the term New World Order. He predicted going to the moon. He predicted the whole thing with Mars, and what he said, the invasion from Mars. All these things. He wrote over 50 books. And undoubtedly the Inklings were profoundly influenced by him, but not that they wished to copy him, because I think they believed he didn't have moral substance in what he was getting across. Some of his works were all on the settlement movement, and he was a member, H.G. Wells was a member of all those groups. He was a friend of Jeremy Bentham, and basically a massive socialist, okay? And so he wrote about what he thought society was going to be restructured into, and oftentimes he was correct. And what we're talking about here, though, is that these writers were all influenced by morality. And when you look into their stories, for instance, Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan. Who's Aslan? He's Christ. That was C.S. Lewis coming to Christ, writing it for children. And in the writing it for children, there was so much morality in it because he was having this great war with Owen Barfield and A.C. Harwood. He came to Christianity through that and then spread it now to all the children that's ever read that. So really what was happening was each of them were going through a moral development. Each of the Inklings going through a moral development. And when they reached that realm of being able to write fantasy, that's moral imagination. But if there was morality in the cosmology of their created world, and you found that thick through C.S. Lewis and many of his works, Till We Have Faces, the Lost Image, the Four Types of Love, all of these things, the Screw Tape Letters, many stories. And what is he doing? Moral development. And what's he coming up with? Inspiration. And if they develop all the way down to a system where people believe they can literally enter into it, that is moral intuition. J.R.R. Tolkien did that. C.S. Lewis, I think, partially did that. But he certainly showed a way, and he was one of the real forerunners in that. Now, Charles Williams, who most people don't know, wrote over 50 novels. He's one of the most popular novelists in England. And all of his novels were like Lord Bulwer-Lytton, who wrote Zanoni and Vril. At one point I went back and I read, a dozen of Bulwer-Lytton's works because they were the esoteric occult works of the time. After that, you started to see people like David Lindsay. You start to see people like H.G. Wells. You start to see Charles Williams writing occult novels that are trying to teach spiritual content in the modern world with modern characters. So almost every one of Charles Williams' works was, in fact, that way. But in his work, and by the way, the beginning work for C.S. Lewis on time and space was called The Dark Tower. Unfinished work. Almost no one ever refers to this. I know this is the volume that was C.S. Lewis's answer to the Inkling Challenge because it's got the Dark Tower in it, the same exact Dark Tower with the same capacities that the Dark Tower had in Lindsay. But in here, then he's able to do much more. He creates a machine that can look back into time. He is able to time travel, space travel, and basically show that there could be multiple dimensions all interpenetrating each other. So that was C.S. Lewis's challenge, his response to the Inkling Challenge. Now, if we talk about Charles Williams, it's this book, and he clearly states it himself, so this is no speculation whatsoever. But it is funny that Tolkien's two works that were his response to the challenge were unfinished, and that The Dark Tower of C.S. Lewis was unfinished, and that people think that all three of those works were done much later than they were, and that there were other things. They think that Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was that challenge. No, I don't believe so. And certainly not the Space Trilogy basically is built upon this story right here. So this, I believe, certainly did come first. Charles Williams wrote Many Dimensions. Now, Many Dimensions. He did not play around. He jumped right into space travel, time travel, dimensions, multi-dimensions, what would happen with temporal anomalies, all these things, all in one book. Now, this was his first book. So he took this challenge very, very seriously, and he became basically a novelist who incorporated fantasy, but not as science fiction per se, as mysticism, more or less. This story starts off with, they happen to get a cube that is from the crown of Solomon, and this cube has tremendous powers to move people through time and space. And he just jumps right in and starts to handle every single dilemma that you would meet if you were going to do this, and also then indicates that it is not about time and space travel. That's not going to do you any good if you don't have consciousness. And so he points that out, and so that's the name of the book, Many Dimensions. He's saying that we are multiple dimensions, all interpenetrating, all happening in different space, in different time, and that you can travel to them. But when you do, you had better be extraordinarily careful. Matter of fact, this would basically be a warning to anyone not to do it. So, Many Dimensions is time and space travel and dimensions. So time travel with Tolkien, space travel with Lewis, time and space travel and dimensions, interpenetrating dimensions with Charles Williams. Now, Owen Barfield mostly wrote philosophical works that are directly connected to anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner's ideas. A lot of people don't understand that when they read his works, and they consider him to be a great philosopher and that he came up with all those ideas himself, which he did not. But the way that he expresses them is incredibly individualized and unique, and he's a brilliant writer and a brilliant mind, and he wrote a number of stories. People will tell you that the challenge was met by Owen Barfield by producing the fairy tale, The Silver Trumpet. There's no space time travel, there's no multiple dimensions, nothing of that in this fairy tale. It's a lovely fairy tale that children really enjoyed, especially the children of Harwood and Barfield. They love the Silver Trumpet. And he also wrote The Child and the Giant, and he wrote a bunch of other stories. And mind you, C.S. Lewis wrote a number of other fantasy stories, which did have space travel in it, as well as other experiments with all kinds of devices for literally defying nature, as it were. And of course, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Smith of Wootton Major and some other beautiful, beautiful Farmer Giles of Ham, things that are space, time, yes, but written in a way that it's almost like a dream. But yes, it is space and time travel. So they continued to try their hand with some fantasy, but their major works, all three of those Inklings, their major works, were well received by the world and have had an impact on people learning to develop their own imagination. Today's world, because of pictures coming at us from all of our digital devices, television and otherwise, children can't create images. Literally, I've tested many, many children, and when they have trouble reading, I find that they can't make an image in their mind. They can't repeat back a tone or an ostinata, a phrase of music, and that many times they have problems with their eardrum, and this stops them from reading, and they don't make pictures in their mind. So you could say, do you see a gray elephant? No. Well, I want you to try to see. No, they can't. Try. Well, what is that? Because we've killed the inner ability to create pictures that are imaginative and that move, many pictures all moving together. This is the realm of the astral world, the realm of astral light, the realm of an infinite amount of two-dimensional images all coming in from all directions to basically create thought. And when it is really filled with morality, and it comes in as thought, it comes in as these powerful imaginations. And some of these writers will tell you these images just appeared in their mind, they started writing about them. It's very, very common. But the inspiration is something you might hear, and intuition is something that you will have to get up and do something about. So when it comes down to it, the real secret in all of this is quite simple. We have a physical, etheric, and astral body. Trying to master them is trying to master space in the astral body, time in the etheric body, and consciousness in the physical. And that's what these imaginal writers were all writing about. And I'm referring to these three now. I'll refer to these two in a minute. So they were actually trying to conquer space, time, and consciousness. That was the real Inkling challenge. Can you write a story that will help you transcend, not travel through, but transcend space, time, and consciousness? And if you read The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and all of the previous books that he built as an entire world, including the Elven language and so much more, you are entering into an imaginal realm that is filled with morality, that is literally trying to show us how to connect to our inner time stream. And that time stream is in the etheric body. But when you're entering into the astral is that whole realm of the stars and the planets, and they're all moving at all times. And so you're trying to conquer space, and that is what C.S. Lewis was so good at. He just climbed in a ship and zoomed off to Mars like it was just commonplace. And traveled later with an angel taking him to Venus. So he covered all the bases in terms of space travel. But when it comes down to it, when you're trying to participate in the initiatory process, you will have to go through these three realms. Space first, time, consciousness. And when you do, if you conquer space, you're going to have imagination, moral imagination. If you conquer time, you're going to receive inspiration. If you conquer the physical and you actually become the master of it, which is almost impossible to do, you start to master the fact of the many dimensions that had to first happen, Saturn, Sun, Moon, before Earth happened. And those are the dimensions that are part of the previous evolution that will then become redeemed and taken to a higher level in the future. And so that is what consciousness is about. The physical body does not create consciousness. It is a vehicle upon which we basically bump up against to wake up to our consciousness. So I believe that the great war between Barfield and C.S. Lewis was the war that also happened with Tolkien. And we see that Tolkien certainly came under the sway of Rudolf Steiner's ideas, anthroposophy, whether he went hook, line, and sinker for them or wanted to become part of the Anthroposophic Society or the cult of the personality of Rudolf Steiner. No, I don't believe he did. And I don't believe that C.S. Lewis did either. But I can tell you that if you read these, and my first encounter with Steiner, I finally realized after studying these things for months and going through dozens of books, rereading all these different stories, I finally realized it. When I read Lord of the Rings was my first encounter with Rudolf Steiner, because in it, in the back, the descriptions of the ancient times that made Middle Earth, I was reading about Atlantis and Lemuria very clearly, and reading about angelic beings who were closer to the earth at that time, and archangelic beings, and this is exactly what Tolkien was writing about. But in a realm that was imaginative, where there was so much moral import, moral connectivity, that you could actually get the point. Same thing with C.S. Lewis. He didn't say it was the planet Mars he went to. He called it a different name. Same thing with Venus. But he used those because they are real. There is moral import. There's cosmic correspondences to the things that were being described by these writers. And in my opinion, that is an imaginal world conception of what anthroposophy would be in one of these imaginal worlds, in one of these inspired worlds filled with imaginative pictures. And that is what Lindsay did. David Lindsay was so powerful with getting you to see and imagine things that have never been seen or imagined before, to feel things that you don't want to feel and you probably will never feel again unless you were reading his other books, which I've now read all of his books, and they're all somewhat like that. But he was never known as a good writer, and he wasn't really popular until now. Now his book is considered one of the best science fiction writings of all times, Voyage to Arcturus, but it still doesn't make it easy to read. So if you can read this book and you can get through it, and you can take up that challenge, the challenge is the following: not what the Inklings did, which was to become authors and write about it. It's for you yourself to understand the process of initiation of mastering space, time, and consciousness. It's as simple as that. Now, did these two, Owen Barfield and A.C. Harwood, master space, time, and consciousness? Absolutely. This one was a Waldorf teacher, so he had to teach the entire cosmology of Steiner in the Waldorf curriculum. And he had to teach in the Anthroposophical Society that cosmology and the beings behind it, the hierarchical beings behind it, and the time sequencings behind it, and the way that it manifested in space as the creation of our solar system. All is there. And both of these two certainly did that. And he, A.C. Harwood, as the head of this school, one of the heads of the school, wrote many fairy tales, many stories, many articles, many things defending anthroposophy, high-level anthroposophical works, so on and so forth. There's a plethora of his work. He is not a well-known author. He wrote The Recovery of Man in Childhood and The Way of the Child, two of the most popular Waldorf books of all times. Besides that, he wasn't known per se, except for being a person who probably helped educate many people who then followed in the footsteps of the Inklings. So A.C. Harwood certainly was a person who conquered space, time, and consciousness through the study of anthroposophy. Owen Barfield, he wrote a book, and people will say it was The Silver Trumpet, or it was The Giant and the Child that was his answer to the Inkling Challenge. No, I don't believe it was. It was this book, which is very hard to find, called The Rose on the Ash Heap. A Rose. Should be The Rose on the Ash Heap. And it's all about space and time. It's about dimensions. It is really an amazing book. It reminds me of Hermann Hesse in his book, Journey to the East. Or I believe, in my opinion, that all of these authors took their inspiration from novellas. And this book is so much like the novellas story called The Novices of Sias, which I think is one of the greatest of all stories written from the imagined world, truly inspired. And this book is all about the divine feminine. This is about a person who was a very high sultan, and he fell in love with this goddess who was a dancer in the temple, and she left, so he followed her all the way to the west until he got a magic key to enter a realm under the ground, under the ash heap that had been made of the materialistic world. So he's describing Ahriman here, the incarnation of materialism. He's describing the search for the divine feminine. This is a wonderful book, and I think it's one of the best that he ever wrote. He also wrote Everspring and some other ones. Those aren't space, time, and dimension transcending books. So I wanted to clarify that, because in every single set of books that I've read about the Inklings, only a smidgen of them understand that these three were profoundly influenced by these two who were anthroposophists. And of course, David Lindsay was not an anthroposophist. He was just a very strange guy, to be quite frank with you. He was an extraordinarily melancholic soul. So what we have here is the injunction that all of us need to have an inkling of how to transcend space, time, and consciousness. In other words, the 3 steps of initiation. And I believe that in their friendship, all of these gentlemen were deeply, deeply affected by the spiritual science of Rudolf Steiner, and that it inspired their work. And in the case of Tolkien and in Lewis, it was clearly in the work. For anyone who's an anthroposophist, if you read it, it would be very hard not to notice. And we can basically say that the Great War that happened between C.S. Lewis and Harwood happened with all of the Inklings who got close to A.C. Harwood and Owen Barfield. And they stayed true to their mission of anthroposophy throughout their entire life and through to the Waldorf School and through all that they were doing. Owen Barfield was a famous anthroposophist traveling all over the world. And so they took up the challenge of understanding a cosmology that transcends space, time, and consciousness. And that is what I'm suggesting that we all do, because when you do that, you are in fact, like Tolkien, looking at the Akashic records, the Akashic Chronicle. You're looking at the ancestral voice that is in all of us. And when that is sparked and enkindled by people who have morally inspired work, then it can truly move people closer to the Spirit without ever using any of the jargon or the language of the Spirit, just basically touching their heartstrings with beautiful imaginative stories. So that is why I wish to bring this to you. And I hope that all of you have a group like the Inklings that you can share your work with and that you can struggle and debate and help each other grow. Because I know that when myself and John Barnwell and Brian Lynch and Robert Thibodeau were all in a group like that for 20 years, it was the same type of inspiration. And it didn't mean we always agreed. It meant that the more that you actually debated, the more you grew.